If you'll just join me in a word of prayer before we continue into the sermon. Dear God and Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the instruction that it brings to us. We thank you for the life that it brings to us, Father. By our Holy Spirit, open it up to us this morning. Keep me from error, and I pray that the truth in it may be clearly communicated through me to the congregation, Lord. Amen. Brother, what shall we do? Was one of Christian in Bunyan's Book of Progress opening speech to his faithful companion, Hopeful. The two pilgrims had, from the weariness of their journey, wandered off the way to the celestial city and taken Bypath Meadow at the recommendation of Vain Confidence, a man they had met on the road. However, they found that Bypath Meadow and going off the way was in fact a much more difficult path than they initially intended, and became flooded, and they had to seek refuge in a nearby land. However, the owner of that land, Giant Despair, found them, captured them, and locked them away in Doubting Castle. Beating them day and night and tormenting them, on one particular occasion, this one, he left them saying, "Why should you choose to live, seeing he's attended with such bitterness?" and taunted them to take their lives. And finding themselves seemingly in an unescapable position, Christian offered this lament and continued his earlier address saying, "The life we now lead is miserable. For my part, I know not whether it is best to live thus or die out of hand. My soul chooses strangling rather than life, and the grave is easier for me than this dungeon." And so in one of many ways, John Bunyan gives us a glimpse into some of the profound sufferings of the two pilgrims on their journey to the celestial cities. But perhaps most significantly, this is perhaps one of their greatest trials. Not the physical challenges they did, not the isolation, but what we would probably call today a suicidal depression. This morning, we're going to go to the Psalter, but not to sing songs of joy while ascending to the top of Mount Zion. We're going to the Psalter with the garments of the mourner and descend into the deepest pits at the very entrance of the grave itself. If you'll open your Bibles to Psalm 88, we'll read our text for this morning, Psalm 88. O Lord, God of my salvation, I cry out day and night before you. Let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry. For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am a man who has no strength. Like one set loose among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more, for they are cut off from your hands. You have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep. Your wrath lies heavy upon me, and you overwhelm me with all of your waves. You have caused my companions to shun me. You have made me a horror to them. I am shut in so that I cannot escape. My eye grows dim through sorrow. Every day I call upon you, O Lord. I spread out my hands to you. Do you do wonders for the dead? The departed rise up to praise you? Is your steadfast love declared in the grave, or your faithfulness in Abaddon? Are your wonders known in the darkness, or your righteousness in the land of forgetfulness? But I, O Lord, cry to you. In the morning my prayer comes before you. O Lord, why do you cast my soul away? Why do you hide your face from me? Afflicted and close to death, from my youth up I suffer your terrors. I am helpless. Your wrath is swept over me. Your dreadful assaults destroy me. They surround me like a flood all day long. They close in on me together. You have caused my beloved and my friend to shun me. My companions have become darkness. Psalm 88, the Psalm of He-Man here, describes the deep suffering of a man pleading seemingly unsuccessfully before God. It's a psalm we know that the Psalms themselves were lyrics written meant to play to music, and I somewhat suspect Psalm 88 won't be topping any charts anytime soon. And we come to perhaps what is the absolute bottom of the Psalter. Lament is very common in the Psalter. It's probably one of its strongest flavors, and it's hard to go even a few songs without recognizing its distinct taste. But there's a few unique features of this song that we're going to look at before we dive in. One is how little praise there is in the song. Really, only the opening line with the declaration of God, that Yahweh is the God of his salvation, is about the only praise that this psalm offers. And perhaps even stranger still is the abrupt ending with no praise, no thanksgiving, no reflection. In fact, the very last word in the Hebrew text is darkness, as it is in the ESV here. This is the gloomiest, the darkest, and perhaps most depressing psalm in the entire Psalter. Before we kind of break down the text and we start looking at it, I want to remind ourselves for a second, what exactly are the Psalms, sort of the context of the entire Psalter. The Psalms are divinely inspired prayers. They are instructions in many ways for relating to God. One of the lasting questions the disciples asked the Lord was, Lord, teach us how to pray. The disciples notably saw Christ rising early in the morning after nights of ministering, probably to the point of exhaustion, to escape to some private place so that he could pray. They heard his prayers in his public teaching, during his private teaching, when he taught the crowds. They saw him pray as he ministered to people and did healings, and likely countless other occasions. And the Psalms follow this same line of questioning. They're saying, Lord, teach us how to pray. So because of that, the Psalms are unique in the Bible. Almost all the other books in the Bible are addressed from God through a person to the people of God. That's usually how it works, whether it's the prophets, the epistles, one of the larger narratives like the gospel. It's God addressing his people through one of his spokesmen, whether an apostle, a prophet, or Moses, something like that. The Psalms are unique because they are not addressed directly to God's people. They are God's people addressing God. So, seemingly rightfully so, the Psalms are actually the largest book in the Bible, the most quoted by Jesus, and perhaps one of the most theologically influential. They also contain some of the most striking features. They're so personal, they're so chock full of struggle, emotion, praise, and victory that there's just so many striking features of them. Some of the Psalms contain shocking prayers for evil to befall enemies, profound confessions of personal guilt that flow from a sense of deep-seated personal depravity, elated praises for God victoriously helping his people, or even the lofty enjoyment of the very person of God himself. And as we see today, we also see a case of deep lament over seemingly unrelenting afflictions from the very hand of God himself. Some people have suggested that the Psalms aren't really theological treatises. And in a sense, that's kind of accurate. I get what the point is. They're not like the epistles where it's very specific doctrinal points. But I think I disagree with that statement. I'm going to say that the Psalms are probably some of the best theological treatises. It's one thing to teach a point of doctrine, and even to teach it well, and the Bible has a very distinct place for that. But it's another thing to live that out, to pray it, to have that theology come out in the various circumstances of your life through your prayers. Ultimately, our responses to circumstances are just our theology being squeezed out of us and being pushed up. So here we have some of the best theology. This is the theology that's in the trenches. Theology from real circumstances in people's lives given to instruct us in how we may live as faithful worshipers of God. So getting a sense for the sort of the mood of the psalm, having read it, its context, let's actually move into breaking the text down. I'm going to actually disagree with this at ESV and how they kind of, this is a slightly minor point, but it's going to help you understand how I structure the sermon. So the ESV kind of breaks it into 4 parts here, from 1 to 2, 3 to 7, 8 to 12, and then 13 to 18. I've broken it up a little bit differently. What I've done, and this is reflected in NIV and as well as a few other translations, is to me it seems that the primary feature here is the use of pronouns, like on a grammatical level. There's the first person pronoun I and the second person pronoun you. This is a dialogue between the psalmist and God. And so if you structure the psalm around those, there's a relatively distinct structure that comes out. So you have the initial prayer in 1 and 2. Then in 3 to 5, you've got 4 sets of lines where the psalmist is just using only the first person pronoun to describe his agony. from verses 6 to 9, just before the end of 9, right at the beginning of 9 there, you've got the psalmist using a second person pronoun to describe God afflicting him. And then you've got this brief interjection of a declaration of his prayers. Then again, it focuses from 10 to 12. You've got another 4 lines focusing on only the second person of God, only the second person pronoun. And then lastly, you've got one more interjection and a conclusion of where it reiterates the same thing, where that second person pronoun, God, is afflicting him in the first person. So this is a deeply personal discussion and prayer that this worshiper, Heman, is having with God. So let's go down. We'll look at the first part here, which will be sort of the invocation and initial petition that starts the psalm. There's a few features I want to notice. This is in verse 1 or 2. One is, and it's absolutely crucial to understand that the very first part, that line in verse 1, sets the tone for the entire song. And we need to have that in our minds as we go forward, because it's really easy to lose sight of it. He says, O Lord, that is the covenant name of God, Yahweh, God of my salvation. This is a faithful worshiper of God who is, at this time, trusting in him for salvation. This is a statement of a hopeful person, a person who has, almost even though being destroyed, still has a faith and trust within Yahweh. He says, I cry out day and night before you. And this will be one of many declarations of his constancy in prayer, that he is coming before him day and night. These are ceaseless prayers at all times and seemingly every day. And he makes his single request. There's only actually one request again made in this psalm right here in the beginning. And that is, God, hear my prayer. Incline your ear to my cry. So the way Hebrew poetry works is that you have these parallels. So essentially, he's saying the same thing. I'll explain parallelism here when we get a better example of it in the next section. But there is one thing that's being said in this. God, I am your worshiper. I am in a covenant relationship with you. You are the God of my salvation. Hear my prayer and save me. That is the single request of this psalm. The entire thing. All of the rest of the psalm is structured around this prayer and desire for God to save him. So let's move now into what he wishes to be saved from, and we'll look at his interpretation. So really what Heman is describing is what we would call, like, at least in our terminology, probably clinical depression. Now, I'm going to warrant that. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we want to understand depression. But first, I want to mention, we just want to look at the experience that he's describing. When a lot of us, maybe if you've read any like pop psychology or evangelical psychology, you'll notice that often these guys have a really great way of just sort of describing perhaps a circumstance you've been in very well. They're very observant, and so they'll kind of like ring your bell and get, oh, that's the idea, that this totally identifies with what I've gone through, or this totally, marks what this person I've seen go through. And so we can kind of buy into some of the theology and maybe some of the interpretations of those experiences and those observations that the author provides. But at this point, we just want to look at what the observation is, what the experience of depression is. There's a few different things that I'm going to mention here. First, he defines it as his soul is full of trouble. When he says full of trouble, there's not a single problem in his life. He's not struggling with finances. He's not struggling with a marital relationship. There's not a single issue. Is that his entire soul, his entire inner person is utterly racked with trouble. Is full, as in that there's no room for anything else. There's nothing but anxiety, grief, sadness, and pain that fill Heman's life. This is the entirety of it. So when he says the word soul here, we don't really want to get too caught up in a sense of maybe an airy-fairy concept of the soul. When the Bible talks about the soul, it's talking about the inner person. Sometimes, we can, when discussing with non-Christians, is there a soul? We kind of got to understand when the Bible uses that term, what it actually means. The Bible talks about people in terms of their outer man and their inner man, and everyone agrees we have those features. We just define them slightly differently. So we're talking about the outer man, we're talking about like the part that you can see, that you can interact with, and that's present for others, it's outside. The inner man are going to be those features of our life which are not visible, not observable to other people around us, including our emotions, our desires, our will, our thought life. Those aren't observable to anyone else. Even when we talk about with science, when we say we have an understanding of brain chemistry now, so we know certain emotions are tied to certain brain chemicals, those brain chemicals aren't identical with the emotions you're experiencing, right? They may be correlated to them, but experiencing emotion is not the same as having a chemical that's associated with it. So we all get that. Even in a secular context, we're still talking about that soul, that inner person. Internally, psychologically, he is completely destroyed. His mind was likely wrapped with anxiety. Every good thought, that things that he perhaps once enjoyed, now becomes tainted with the jabbing pain of a malignant sadness. Like a cancerous growth metastasizing to every nook of his mind. There is nothing he can enjoy. He is in a living hell. And I'm not using that vulgarly. That's actually what he's saying. That's probably the best paraphrase that I could come up with for what he's described here. Because he says, his soul draws near to Sheol. Sheol is the place of the dead in the Old Testament. We talk about hell today more in the concept of being the opposite of heaven. There's a place of blessing, there's a place of judgment. The ancient mind didn't really understand the afterlife so much in those contexts. In the Old Testament, Sheol is just a general place of the dead. To be cut off from the land of the living, to die is bad, always bad in the New Testament, is never good. And to go, where you go is the pit, the grave. Somewhere, probably, the imagery is usually used somewhere deep in the earth. And it's just a general place of the dead. An example of this, and we'll get you to flip there, but when Samuel appears to Saul, Saul conjures up Samuel through a necromancer and he wants advice for the Philistine battle, the Philistines he's about to face. And Samuel says to him, well, tomorrow you're going to be here with me. And I've heard some Bible interpreters say, well, he's saying that Saul is now saved, Saul's going to heaven. That's not what he's saying. He's saying you're going to be in the pit. You're going to be in the grave, the general place of the dead. The New Testament actually elaborates quite greatly on the afterlife in terms of, places of blessing and judgment. There's hints of it in the Old Testament, but primarily this is a bad place. It's bad to die, right? No brainer. But that's very much the Old Testament view, is to be in the land of the living, is to be tied to still the presence of God, be able to worship Him and enjoy Him. So he says that he is in a living hell. He is like dead and alive. So this is a really great example here. If you want to follow this, a great example of Hebrew poetry that we'll notice in verses 3 to 5. So English poetry is marked by rhythm. It's not actually rhyming. The chief feature of English poetry is rhythm. That's why Shakespeare sounds good, but a lot of it isn't rhyming. Same with Milton, even rap music, screamo music. The reason why screamo music is still English poetry is because it's primarily based on rhythm, right? Ryan will tell you, yeah. Right? So that's the primary feature of English poetry. The primary feature of Hebrew poetry is parallelism. So the idea is that you have one thought here, and you'll actually see the ESV indents it. You have a second line here. And then an idea in the first line sort of will be picked up upon, and something's done with it in the second line. Sometimes the idea is expanded upon, something's added to it, sometimes an opposite is provided, but it's always this idea, some idea in the first line is adapted to the second line. So let's just read that, just because it's such a powerful movement here. It says, my soul is full of troubles. My life draws near to Sheol. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am a man who has no strength. Like one set loose among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave. Like those whom you remember no more, for they are cut off from your hand. So he says, my soul is full of troubles. It's going near to the pit. I am even counted among those. Like, just people assume that I'm as good as dead. I am like a man who has no strength. And he says, I am like one set among the dead. He's already in the dead. I am like the slain in the grave. Like those whom you remember no more, cut off. He's moving from this place where I'm in a state of turmoil to where he's cut off from all life and from the very presence of God. That's the idea. There's that progression there. And authors throughout the ages have described very similar experiences. And in fact, darkness, deep pits, emptiness, nothingness, oblivion, and death are the common stock of depressive imagery. C.S. Lewis is quoted as saying, my heart is empty. All the fountains that should run with longing are in me dried up. The great Charles Spurgeon wrote, I could weep by the hour like a child and yet not know what I wept for. And this is one of the descriptions, one of his many depressive episodes that he has. More modern technical descriptions are going to include these from a few different authors. One says, depression involves a complete absence of effect, absence of feeling, absence of response, absence of interest. The pain you feel in the course of a major clinical depression is an attempt on nature's part to fill up the empty space. But for all intents and purposes, the deeply depressed are just the walking, waking dead. Another description goes, profound melancholia is a day in, day out, night in, night out, almost arterial level of agony. It is pitiless, relentless pain that affords no window of hope, no alternative to a grim and brackish existence, and no respite from the cold undercurrent of thought and feeling that dominate the horribly restless nights of despair. From an observational level, this is exactly what the psalmist here is describing. It echoes all his sentiments. He says, almost the image, he says he's like a dead soldier, like he's like on the battlefield. The last bits of vitality ebbing out from his body as he's being stripped of his belongings, cut off from God, as he watches his life end. But he still keeps going, he's still there. The worst part is the pain doesn't end for him. So, we'll talk a little bit about how we want to understand what depression is. This is more look at the observation of it. We'll interpret what depression is in a second, and later on in the sermon, I should say. We'll also talk about what can kind of influence, including our own personal involvement in depression, but ultimately, the Bible categorizes depression as suffering. Depression is suffering. That's the broad theological category that we want to put depression into. And so we want to understand depression as suffering as well as we understand any other type of suffering. And this means if we understand it that way, we can start to assess depression theologically, right? Because we can assess, the Bible talks immensely about suffering, right? We just got to put it in that category, which the Bible does, and we can start understanding it a little bit more in depth than perhaps we're used to. And in fact, the psalmist does exactly that. In the next part, he begins to assess his suffering theologically. However, it's maybe not in the most positive way. He recognizes God's sovereignty. He recognizes that there's no events in his life that God's outside of, that God's not in control of. All these afflictions he's experiencing, even his inward toil, God is still sovereign over that. He recognizes it. And he directly says, like, as we see that parallel, right? He's moving like one who's, he's full of trouble. He feels like he's dead. Now he's cut off from God. Then it switches to this next section here. And he says, you have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions, dark and deep. He even knows that he doesn't suffer randomly. He's suffering because God has brought this suffering on him. He's not only a walking corpse in his own mind and actually near to death, it seems, but God is the one who puts him here. And so just pick up again on some of this dark and deep imagery. This is often used for think of like a deep ocean cavern, right? Imagine that God essentially has taken He-Man and He's put him in one of these deep caves, like maybe something that one of the ocean divers are going to. He's put him in there. He's cut the rope off. The battery's gone. The light's out. He's miles away from oxygen and light. Anywhere near escape. In an unending maze of caverns, tunnels, corridors, and dead ends, some of which are just barely able to contain his body. And this is how he feels. So not only does Heman suffer the profound psychological agony of depression, but he feels as if God's wrath were upon him. He says here, your wrath lies heavy upon me. You overwhelm me with all your waves. So just continuing on that image of being underwater there, you can imagine all the weight of the millions of liters of water in the ocean pressing in upon him. This is like God's wrath coming in, squeezing the oxygen from his blood, pressing on his eyes, his ears. Tightness fills every part of his body, even to his lungs. And that's how he feels with God. This is how much God's wrath weighs upon him. That he doesn't even have comfort in his conscience right now. He has no comfort in salvation, but he feels as if God himself is his very enemy. He continues that he has complete social isolation. He says, you have caused my companions to shun me. You have made me a horror to them. Now, there seems to be at least an underlying hint of possibly leprosy or some other serious affliction There's nothing stated explicitly. Even at no point states exactly what his particular troubles are. His language is very general. But there's this undercurrent of physical suffering, and the fact that his companions are isolating him would possibly indicate leprosy. Becoming a leper in the ancient world and in the Old Testament would mean that you would be completely cut off from all social contact. You would be ostracized and cast out of your community. So, on top of his whatever physical suffering he's got going on, the profound oppression, the sense of God's wrath destroying him, he has to suffer it alone. There is no one there to comfort him, no one to offer a word of encouragement, no one to pray for him. And this likewise also is not uncommon in Christian experience. I've got a lengthy quote here I'm going to read from you from one Christian author who's now passed. Just because I'm going to read it at length because it just exemplifies it better than I think I could illustrate it for you. And he says, but now that the hope is deferred and returning health seems to loiter by the way, recovery is delayed, and the trial lengthens out like an ever-lengthening chain, my soul begins to faint and tire, and the burden to grow heavier. Even those who love me most, my pain and helplessness is now an accustomed thing, while to me it keeps its keen edge of suffering, but little dulled by use. My ills to them are a tedious, oft-told tale which comes with something of a dull reiterance. It becomes almost a matter of course that in the pleasant plan I should be left out, that in the pleasant walk I should be left behind. A matter of course that the pleasures of life should pass me by with folded hand and averted face, and sickness and monotonous days and gray shadows should be my portion. And oh my God, my spirit sometimes faint beneath the nameless dread that this loneliness will grow deeper and deeper. If it be that thy will that my sickness should continue or recovery be long delayed, I can no longer be the companion of those I love. Shall I be as dear to them as if I could have been kept by their side, and bound up with all their active interests and pleasures? I have to see others take my place and do my work for them. Shall I not suffer loss in their eyes, and others enter into the heritage of love which might have been mine? Will they not grow weary of me, weary of the same old ills, oft repeated but ever new, and turn with an unconscious feeling of relief to brighter hearts and more joyous lives? Such is Heman's case right now. However, there is just a jarring and shocking juxtaposition that comes into this. He says now, with a complete break, he says, every day I call upon you, Lord. I spread out my hands to you. Again, he's returning to that initial statement he made right at the beginning of the psalm, that Yahweh is the God of his salvation, and he prays to him constantly. He is pleading for his deliverance. He's still coming before him. He hasn't stopped praying to him. He hasn't stopped interceding on his own behalf to God. He has not casted off his hope. And Heman then, in this next section, so we'll be moving now from 10 to 12, Heman begins to question God. However, remember, these are inspired prayers. These are prayers which we can comfortably utter in the presence of God. So when Heman questions God, he doesn't offer threats against him. He doesn't judge God. He doesn't pronounce actions against his wrong. He doesn't judge God's actions as wrong. And he doesn't get angry at God. There's not a sense of that at all. In fact, his questions reflect a deep understanding of the glory of God and his character and his majesty. And if you read that, his main concern when he questions God is, God, how will you be glorified if you slay me? How can you be glorified in me if I'm dead? If you kill me like this, how can I praise you? How do you benefit from this, God? He's not even praying for his own life. He actually, in this case, considers God's glory more important than his own suffering and his own life. And he says that, imagine this, just imagine you're talking to someone like this. They've suffering prolonged depression. They have severe physical ailments. They're without friends or companions, and literally at death's door. And he says, God, how does this glorify you? Right? His concern isn't for his primarily, it's tied up with it, right? He's obviously concerned for his health. He's praying because he wants to be delivered. But his primary question to God is, how do you benefit from this? right? How does this bring you glory? I'm concerned about you. So just let that linger for a second and think about how we want to respond to these type of circumstances and whether we would find those type of responses coming from our own heart. And even then, just the constancy in his prayer. At the end of this section here again, he says, "But I, O Lord, cry to you. In the morning my prayer comes before you." He still says, even though God, I don't understand how you're glorified by this, I want to see you benefit. I still trust in you, Lord. And in the morning my prayer comes before you. The concept of coming to God before in the morning is the diligence. Even in the midst of prolonged suffering, prolonged pain, prolonged sadness, the first thing that this guy's doing is going and offering God praise and prayer and dependence upon him. That shows that that is a heart fully dependent upon God, not on his own strength, not on his own interest, but he is depending entirely upon God to relieve him. Now, for those of you who've sort of followed, if you're familiar at all with the biblical text, this is kind of actually a fairly standard pattern that Heman shows here. And the one time I don't number my pages is the time I get them mixed up. Here we go. Sorry. So those attuned to biblical prayers like this, if you think of Moses when he's interceding on the mountain for behalf of Israel, they've sinned, God's going to destroy them. And Moses prays for God's glory. And this is usually the turning point, right? Like the worshiper here is, in this case, he's a faithful worshiper. He's concerned about Yahweh's glory. God sees that and responds by delivering them or offering some kind of response to the prayer. So that's sort of like, if you've read the Bible enough, you probably may get a sense that that's where this goes. Right? That's at least a hint of mild expectation that that's kind of what's coming next. However, in fact, this is, though, the center, the climax of the psalm. Right there when he says, when he offers us that he's going to pray, and then he offers God, how are you glorified by this? We've hit the climax. Hopefully now it's the turning point, right? And there's sort of the gradual, resolution that comes. But that's not the case. There's no gradual resolution. This climax is a dead drop-off. In the next portion, he says, "Why do you cast my soul away, and why do you hide your face from me?" The reality, and then he continues the next point here, where he again just reaffirms that God is destroying him. He has cast away all his hope. He says here, "Afflicted and close to death from my youth up. I suffer your terrors, I am helpless." There is no resolution here for Heman. All his pleadings, his trust in God, has brought him no salvation, no response, no comfort, no sense of salvation. No sense of salvation, anyways. The psalm doesn't end with praise. It doesn't end with reflection. It doesn't really end with anything that even seems like an ending. Like it just drops. Like it's this jagged edge at the end of this, blade here that's been jabbed into you after you've read this psalm. And ultimately, though, this will help us understand what the psalm is doing, why the psalm doesn't end. This is not a psalm written by someone who's looking back to reflect upon a trial. This is not someone who's looking back to see what God has brought out of suffering. This is the psalm of someone in that suffering, who sees no end to it, and who doesn't have a hope at this point that it will be finished. The effect is to leave you hanging. It's not supposed to give you a sense of resolution. And remember, these are inspired prayers. The point is that it's supposed to do that because there are times in your life where it will be like that, where there won't be a sense of resolution. You won't see the good coming from it. There won't be an end to the suffering and the pain, at least not immediately. You, at this point, can't see the good that God can bring from it. You aren't any better. And the promises of life and resurrection are far off and don't even seem to be accessible to you. You've got no comfort from the scriptures in the terms of that you feel you're saved. The suffering is seamlessly pointless, abrupt, ongoing, and unceasing. So the purpose of this psalm, as in many psalms, is to teach us, it's to give a context for those who are grieving like this. It's to give a context for those who are suffering the deepest depths of this type of depression, to be able to utter their sufferings, to utter their trials before God in such a way that they don't have to feel like they should feel joyful at the end. Because that's more than, that's a burden to place on some people. They can't feel joy. They can't feel hope for the future. They trust in God. Yes, they hope for salvation from Him, and they haven't let off Him. But there isn't that joy, and it won't come for them, at least not right away. So that's what the psalm is doing. That is the point. It's to give us a context for grief, the context for how to express that type of suffering in a manner that still relies on God, that is still trusting in Him, and in a way that is still pleasing Him, in a way that doesn't sin, in a way that we can have both that. We can still retain our faith in God, but still express the deepest and most profound suffering of the body and the soul together. And this is very relevant to us. We, in fact, as a culture, are perhaps more susceptible to depression than almost any age before, which is quite interesting. We live in a near utopia, really, in a lot of ways. If you would have told people centuries ago that we had unimpeded access, well, relatively unimpeded access to healthcare, they had running water in their homes, and excessive overabundance of food, longevity, and rapidly advancing electronic technology everywhere. And that's unthinkable. Yet, if you read the statistics, and this one's particularly interesting, if you were born after 1950, you are 20 times more likely to be clinically depressed than if you were born before 1910. So the rate of incidence, and the incidence of depression in our culture has skyrocketed, and it's not slowing down. Not only has psychiatry currently now is the highest prescribing medical profession. We are really in the age of melancholy in a number of ways. Even the age of which people are experiencing clinical depression, research have shown is becoming younger and younger. I mean, there's always a certain percentage of people that it's happened to, but the incidents at younger and younger ages are happening. And it doesn't seem to be slowing down. So what I want to do now is I want to look at this. There's two things. I think we are going to move to a sense of resolution. I will get you guys there. But there's two things there's two kind of errors I think we can make when we're looking at the psalm. The one is that we can jump to that really quick. Or before we're even like halfway through the psalm, we're already reading Revelation 20 and the end of the book of Job, right? Or, like we just jump there too quick. And there's a few cultural reasons why I think we have a susceptibility to depression, but we don't want to jump to it. The point of the psalm is to sort of sit in the morning and give a context for that grief. So we don't want to jump there too soon. The other end is, I think, the other error we treat as if there really is no other context to the psalm. This is one psalm. It is abrupt end because it's not meant to be the end, right? It's got that jagged, sharp edge because this is someone going through the suffering. The suffering does end, and we're going to look how to move beyond that, okay? So we just don't want to err on either ways. So I want to think, why then this is so important to us, and when we talk about what makes us particularly susceptible to depression in the culture, because these things, if that's going on around us, I mean, that's going to affect us too, right? Many of us may have found ourselves in a situation similar to Heman, or if we don't, we certainly know someone who has, or maybe we will find ourselves soon. So there's a few forces, I think, at work around us that influence this. And I'm going to mention three in particular. We could probably name multiple, but there's three. We're going to talk about individualism, talk about consumerism. We'll also talk about secular, just the attitudes our culture has, generally speaking, towards suffering. But even before we get to that, I want to mention that when we're talking about this type of depression, there does seem to be, we can see a physical correlation with what's going on in him. He's obviously physically suffering. And from all the research, it seems to be showing us that there is a small percentage of individuals, let's say of all the people who are clinically depressed, maybe like 5-10%, actually seem to have some kind of underlying physiological problem that leads to this depression. Okay, so there could be an element of that here. So when we see the rise of depression, we got to recognize that there's forces outside of the biological. That's really where we go. We talk about psychiatry being the highest prescribing profession right now, medical profession. Partially the assumption is because there's going to be an underlying physiological assumption. So, I mean, that's just a question that's really common. around this, so I'm going to deal with it right out of the get-go. If we look at the medical research, we want to understand that first. Pretty much ignore anything any folk psychologist or folk evangelical psychologist has ever told you, because most of it's wrong. Like, if you look at the actual research, and if you're going to actually do the guys doing the research, they're very warranted in the types of claims they made on what we understand about the mind and the body. It's nothing anywhere close to as simple as if we have, like, I've heard some guys say, and they're admittingly being general, but like even then is totally not accurate. They'll say, well, you got a broken bone, you put a cast on, you make it better. You're depressed, you have a chemical disorder, and you fix it. That's not the case. We have about 50 or 60 years, about 3 major families of drugs we've been using to treat clinical depression, and we still don't know how they work. If you go and read the studies, like big textbooks I found, and multiple journal articles, they read, it's inconclusive, we don't know. They work on some people, they really do. Like, there's a small percentage of people, if you're taking some kind of antidepressant, it will do something for you, but we don't know why, even after decades of research. It doesn't make people who are not depressed feel better, it doesn't make them happier, and it doesn't work on all people, and it doesn't work consistently on all people. And other things do similar effects. Electroconvulsive therapy on a small percentage of people produces some improvements for periods of time. We just don't know. So the reality is we gotta kind of move ourselves out of the attitude of, this really progressed, advanced culture that has the mind figured out to more back where He-Man is, where if we're suffering because of some physical ailment, we may not even know what it is, and we may not be able to do anything about it. Even if there is an underlying physiological component, we may not be able to fix it. So let's just put that out there. With that, I still think doctors are good, right? It's not a dig against psychiatry primarily. This is what the psychiatrists themselves are saying, right? Is that they're saying we're overprescribing. They're saying that really, there's maybe 5 to 10% of people. The terms they use to say there's people who are actually mentally ill. They talk about a physical illness, and then they'll say the other 80 to 90% are what they call the worried well. People who don't have an underlying physiological component, but they have some other psychological issues that can't be fixed with a pill or with any other physical treatment. So I want to get that out there. So there's obviously other forces outside that are producing these type of depression in us and make us susceptible to it. One of which I said is individualism. We live in an age where we have bucked authority, we have bucked institutions for the sake of living out our own individual expression and freedoms. So because of that, we've seen a breakdown of almost all the major institutions within society. We've seen the breakdown of religious institutions, churches. We've seen the breakdown of families, the primary institution, right? These are all just falling, not totally being destroyed, but they're falling to pieces around us. What's happening in a large majority of people's life is they've moved from being part of the community with, understanding their identity. Again, a lot of these issues we're talking about individualism, consumerism, are coming down to how we perceive our identity. That culture, we don't perceive ourselves as belonging and being identifying with a particular institution. We see ourselves largely as an individual with a network. And for a lot of those people without institutions, those networks are fragmented, right? It's easy to fall off, follow people who live across the city or live across, provinces. Institutions sociologically help build cohesion. There are still cultures in the world where they've identified a 0 rate of depression, and they tend to be very socially cohesive, as in you belong to the institution very strongly, there's high social expectation, and the social bonds between people are very high, right? So we have to be aware of that. That's one of the things I think going on. One of the other issues is consumerism. And partially consumerism, we can understand that as the crass sort of materialism of getting stuff, but consumerism primarily is being identified with what we consume. Our identity is caught up in the products that we buy and what we consume. And this is what's sold to all of us thousands of times a day. And I don't mean that as a hyperbole. We literally see thousands of messages a day that sell us the philosophy of consumerism through advertisement. Advertisers and marketers don't really need to make a logical presentation to get you to buy a product. They need to get you to buy a philosophy, to feel an emotion, to hang their product on that emotional hook. If they can do that, you have positive associations, you're much more likely to buy the product. That's what they're aiming to do, right? And just think of any of the commercials. I know the ones that always pop in my mind, the guys with the, 2 guys in the driveway with the car, right? One's washing the car, he's got the Honda, the other dude's got the Toyota or whatever. I drive Toyota, so. But whatever, right? You pick the wrong car, or what's the the cell phone, the cellular network one. There's a guy who's kind of got the big fish eyes. He's like kind of goofy looking, and like he's always got the bad network, so he's losing out on deals. And then there's the other like relatively good-looking guy who seems to have attractive women around him, who's like got the awesome network, so he's, you know, he always gets the deal that the other guy missed out on, right? You know, these guys are, this philosophy is underlying all sorts of stuff and is constantly being sold to us. But it's empty. We all know what it is. If you're living from, you know, product cycles to product cycle, like that's a vain existence. But this creeps into our worldview because it's pushed on us constantly. It's right in our face. We're being like advertisers pay lots of money because it works, right? Like they don't spend millions of dollars at the Super Bowl because none of us are convinced by their ads to buy their philosophy. It works, right? So that's what's going on, and really, I think, in some cases, depressed individuals are people who just see through that. They see that the end is pointless product cycles that are really ultimately unsatisfying and death. That's what it comes down to. And then even secular attitudes towards suffering. Really, within our culture, we have no purpose for suffering. Christian theology gives us a robust purpose for suffering, but culturally, we don't have it. And all the talks you hear about euthanasia, how often the topic of quality of life comes up. And when you think about quality of life, what they're saying is like, well, if I'm suffering, to a certain extent, there's no point in living. That's really the foundation of the argument. And that's like the negative end. There's very positive, like, still like positive in the sense that like it's the positive side of like a bad idea, but that's sold to us. One really popular song right now on the radio by Pharrell Williams is called Happiness, or Happy. And there's this phrase in it that just continually reiterates, and I find it it's so revealing. Like, it's fascinating. And it's this really catchy, kind of upbeat song. And he says, clap along if you feel like happiness is the truth. And you're just like, yeah, but you think about it, that's awful. That is a terrible statement. Like, that is like straight from the pit of hell. Like, actually. Because if you feel like happiness is the truth, and we can talk about, you know, feeling what's the truth. I mean, there's issues behind that. But this whole concept that you feel like happy, well, what if you're depressed? What purpose is there for suffering in a worldview where happiness is the truth? And millions of people listening to the song dozens of times a day, right? Including me, apparently. So these forces are all around us, continually pressing in on us. So we need to be very aware of how to both understand depression and suffering and to help other people around us, because it's going to be common. And I think sadly evangelicalism at times is sometimes noted by a sort of a faddish obsession with cultural trends and market demands, more than I think biblical truth. And this is one profound example, I think, that ties directly to what we're talking about today, is how we've pretty much utterly jettisoned psalmody within the church, and utterly jettisoned and lost touch with the Psalms and the overall tenure of them. Now, I'm going to preface this saying, Car does an awesome job here at the church. This is not, what I'm talking about here, I talked about before this, I really enjoy the Psalms and the music that Cara picks here. She does an excellent job, and I'm very thankful for the whole music team. So this isn't by any music critique of her. This is sort of the broader evangelical culture that we kind of all belong to here. You want to think like the top 40 Christian charts. That's more or less what I'm talking about. So, but if you look through that, I mean, it's crazy. We're like in the only generation that has completely just like not using the Psalms as like a regular part of our daily life and worship. If you grew up in an Anglican church, you would literally hear 5 Psalms a day, every single day. Right? They have their morning, their midday, and their afternoon service. And that consists of Bible readings and GraceLife, but every day, 5 Psalms. And most of the churches understood that the Psalms would be vital to Christian life. And if you look at the Psalms, they're primarily lament Psalms. Like the largest genre in the Psalm, the Psalter, is lament. There's other ones, and we don't want to ignore those other parts, right? There's times for rejoicing, but the Psalms are very sad. They're very heartbreaking a lot of the times. And even then, as I was talking with Cara about, you know, trying to select music, she's like, man, this is really hard to find sad music. Like there's something that expresses something of this sort of character. I think I looked through the Getty songs too. I think this is the only one they have in there that Cara found that actually was sort of like generally in tune with like a suffering person. If you look on the top Christian charts, like they're just not there. There's mentions of suffering, but they just tend to, like I said, immediately skip over that suffering and move to a place of triumphalism. Move to a place where we're already glorified. And just sort of like the suffering is like a side note, it's mentioned, it's not dwelt upon. So what this eventually does with us, when we have evangelicalism, it gives the impression that suffering is not okay. That unless you're happy, healthy, and wealthy, that there's something wrong with you. And that's not the case. This depression, psychological suffering of this kind is the normal lot of a number of Christians. This is a regular part of Christian life. Maybe not for everyone, right? And maybe not to the same degree. But this is a normal part of Christian experience, to suffer these type of depressive episodes. And this is part of living in a sinful, fallen world, part of the griefs. Just the same way that we expect physical pain to be part of the Christian experience in different degrees and in different varieties for different people, it's the same on the other end with psychological suffering. If we understand the categories, right? So let's move on now. Let's actually move to the point where we can kind of see some resolution. And I want to look at a few points from the text to move forward and how we can actually deal with this. So the first point, and my mom's here, so I'm going to embarrass her, but you need to know God. One of the things my mom would always tell me when I was still living at home before I went to university, she'd constantly be studying the book of Job, or just, every few months she'd say, I'm studying on suffering, sort of saving up a storehouse of knowledge so that when she would come to a point of suffering, probably when I moved home or something. That was time. That she'd have a storehouse, that she'd have sort of this ability to know God and understand what it's like to serve God in suffering, so that when those times came, she could deal with it. And this is exactly what we see with Heman here. Again, the primary statement at the beginning of the song is that he is a worshiper and a faithful servant of Yahweh. He trusts in him for salvation, and that the most constant phrase is repeating day and night that he's crying out, that he's praying to God. That is the common refrain throughout this whole song. And that means that you have to actually know God. You have to know God well enough that when, like I said, those circumstances, when they come, those circumstances aren't producing what your response is. They're squeezing your theology out of your heart, essentially. That pressure is going to produce what's really inside, how you really view the world, how you really view God. So we have to know him. A really practical example. I'm a musician. I've had interactions with a lot of musicians, and you always hear these anecdotal stories about like the really, really great musicians. Like maybe some of the the rock stars, or like Chet Baker if you're into the jazz blues world, and that these guys would become completely intoxicated. Like they couldn't walk. People would be dragging them on stage, but as soon as they have put an instrument in their hand, it's like you plug them in, and they would play the songs flawlessly. Right? Now, not like in that intoxication part, but just that sense that they knew that piece of music, and they knew their instrument so well, so instinctively, that just when the opportunity came, they just played it, and it came out right. Right? If you want to think of the knowledge of God like that, it's so embedded, the muscle memory is so deep in your being, when you begin to suffer, praise and doxology like this just comes forth out of you. The second immediate application to that is to constantly draw near in prayer. Right? There is a point where, right, the diligence that Heman has in prayer, you need to retain that hope. Even in this context, this is retaining hope in the midst of suffering that doesn't seem to be end. We want to give a context to that, but you have to stay close to God in these cases. You have to be diligent to maintain those basic practices of coming to know God and staying close to him in prayer. And that really could probably be the most difficult thing you can do in those circumstances. A number of take for granted the fact that we have energy. We want to study and pray our Bible, that we even have the cognitive capacity to pray and study our Bible. But for people with severe depression, that's not always the case. You read numerous case studies where people say they just want to read the Bible, they want to pray, but they can't. It's like they're illiterate. They read the words, but no meaning comes out to them because they're so fried in their mind they can't perceive the Scriptures. So this is when this could literally, like I said, be the most challenging thing you could ever do. It's something as simple as praying and reading the Bible when you're suffering like this. You have no energy, you have no desire, there is no joy in it. Right? But to cling to that hope, because that is the vital thing that will keep you going. And if you want some really practical, here's a really, really practical thing if you need this. If you struggle with prayer, because I think a lot of us do. Take 12 things to focus on in prayer. Just pick 12 things, 12 different categories. Maybe it's friends, family, you want to give thanks to God for something. Maybe confess sins. Just take 12 different categories, things that you can focus on. And then pray for each one for 5 minutes. Right? Most of us can pray for 5 minutes, typically. But by finding someone to focus on, this is a really great way. If you do that, you're at an hour. Okay, so there's lots of simple little things that can help you to maintain that prayer life and to maintain those habits now before you enter the dark times and to maintain them during them. And in this case, one of the best applications, if you are depressed, is to go to the Psalms. Go to the old hymns. Go to these resources that you have for people to express your emotions and when you can't. Right? That's one of the reasons we're giving this stuff, is because you have a means by which you can pray this back to God. You can comfortably pray every prayer in the Psalter knowing that God is pleased with them. Knowing that they are upright, that they are, that you are bringing Him joy by praying Psalm 88 when it totally resonates with you. So use that. Use the hymns. A number of the old hymns were designed for that exact purpose. And it's kind of funny, if you look at hymns from about 200 years ago and earlier, to the same extent that we don't have many that are really about suffering and genuine sorrow, it's kind of the flip side. If you go back about 200 years, that's what the majority seem to be about. There's a lot. So it's not hard to find them if you look back. So these are the type of things. Take advantage of these type of resources. And, realistically, like when you're dealing with other people, the flip side of it is when you see people depressed, look for signs of these things and just listen to someone. If anything, this should tell us that there is a place for just airing grief, airing lament before God. And then we want to create context for that. That's what the Psalm's trying to do. So we want to be, as Christian brothers and sisters, willing to create that type of environment. If we see someone suffering, often it's just simply enough to hear it out, let them lament, and point them to the Psalms. Point them to these places where they can air their lament, without necessarily focusing on making them feel like they have to be joyful. They have to be, clapping their hands because they feel like happiness is the truth. And the ultimate, though, and so these are sort of small remedies. These are things that are important, but the ultimate thing is that the Psalms, one of the contexts of the Psalms is that these are also, by inspired prayers, these are also many of the prayers of Christ. In fact, Psalm 88 has historically been read with Psalm 22 on Easter Friday. Christ himself is a man of sorrows, of constant pain. He had no home, despised and rejected by men, suffering, agony. I mean, when we're going through the Psalms, like Christ suffered profoundly. So when you pray to him, you can, even though you may feel like He-Man in the sense where you say, like, God, why have you cast off your soul? You come to a sympathetic Savior who has suffered as you are suffering and is sympathetic to those prayers. He knows the heartache, he knows the pain, and he responds. The ultimate hope as well, know that Christ, as the man of sorrows, conquered death and rose from the grave. There is the hope of the resurrection. Like I said, that's not the primary focus of that, but that's there. When you're hoping in God, God will save you. This life isn't the final hope. Some people may be just a week or two away from getting a doctor's diagnosis, or from some critical injury which will leave you crippled or have some terrible consequence from which you will never be free from in this life. And the reality is that this life isn't that hope. So while we can cling to hope in this life, the ultimate hope is that just as Christ was raised from the dead, so we too can have that same hope. And you need to cling to that. So when in your prayers, one of the things that I try to make a constant in my life is focusing on the resurrection, taking time every day to focus on the resurrected life. What would we like to be like in the new heavens and earth? And to long for that internally. To sort of wean myself from the love of this world. And likewise, this isn't a place where we stay. And Bunyan, returning to him, didn't intend Christian to stay in the dungeon either. And I'll read just a portion from this here. And Christian says, realizing, he says, as one half amazed, he broke out into a passionate speech and said, "What a fool am I to lie in a stinking dungeon, when I may as well walk liberally. I have a key in my bosom called promise, that will, I am persuaded, open any lock in Doubting Castle." Hopeful responds, "That's good news, good brother. Pluck it out from thy bosom and try." Then Christian pulled it out of his bosom and began to try the dungeon door, whose bolt, as he turned the key, gave back, and the door flew open with ease, and Christian and Hopeful both came out. Then he went to the outward door that leads into the castle yard, with his key, opened that door as well. And then he went to the iron gate, for that must be open too, but the lock was desperately hard. Yet the key did open it. Then they thrust open the gate to make their escape with speed. So, likewise, we want to follow Bunyan's instruction in this case and understand that we do have with us a key of promise in the Scripture, and that will avail to us. I'm going to ask the music team to come up now.